patience, everybody. We have had back-to-back hui for most of this day. So this is a public workshop on the review of Social and Rec Fund, and I will hand over to the officers. Thank you.
Kia ora. Quite a shift from your previous briefing. Hopefully it will be nice and refreshing for you in a positive conversation. Let me just introduce the team really quickly, and then we can get into the content of the workshop. I think everybody knows Mark Farrar. He's been around for a long time and very capably and effectively leads us through our grant processes. Sean on the right is our funding team leader, and she leads the team of funding advisors. And I'll get Sue to introduce herself. Sue might not be familiar to all of you, but is a fascinating person.
No pressure. Tēnā koutou. My name is Sue, and I'm a philanthropic consultant, so I support funders to establish, implement and review their funds. I have an ongoing role as a EO of a spend down fund for workforces, and I was previously Chief Executive of Philanthropy New Zealand, so therefore I have an understanding of good grant making practices and the ecosystem and who the players are. Thank you.
And Sue has been supporting us through this work and leading some of our external engagement work that she will talk to shortly as well. I first thought I would talk very briefly around the fund that we're talking about, the Social and Recreation Fund, and that exists to support projects and organisations that deliver outcomes that improve community resilience, harm reduction, community safety and social wellbeing. Really broad really broad fund. It is the largest of the grant funds that we have. The total spend is just over $5 million, or just under $5.5 million, and that entire fund is within the scope of the work that we are doing, with the exception of a very small amount of money that is set aside for the Tawa community grants, and the Tawa Community Board set the priorities for that amount of money, but the rest of the fund is within scope of the work that we are doing. I wanted to give some context to this work and some of the challenges that prompted us to bring this to you. The Social and Recreation Fund has existed in its current form since 2005, the 2005-2006 year, and it has had very few changes made since then. And that means that as the strategic priorities of the city have changed, the social priorities and the social needs of the city have changed, the priorities of the fund have not really changed to align with the changes to the city. And that means that officers and the grant subcommittee are making the best decisions we can with the information that we have and the best recommendations that we can, but without a lot of strategic direction or strategic guidance. That means, in effect, we continue to fund the same organisations. So some of them we've funded since 2005 or 2000, many of them we have. And we don't have the ability currently to change those funding arrangements where they no longer align to the council priorities, because the priorities of the fund have not changed accordingly. And that makes it really difficult when the social needs of the city change to be able to address those needs without requesting additional funding. Probably quite a good example is that some of the social needs of the city since COVID have changed, but we haven't adjusted the priorities of the fund accordingly. One of the things we know that we need to do differently and we need to improve is the performance reporting of the organisations that we fund. What I mean by that is organisations currently provide reporting to us, very good reporting, on any funding that they've received and what they've done with the funding. But what we need to do is lift that to a level that allows us to, of course, make sure that organisations we fund are doing the things they've said they're going to do, but also to enable us to demonstrate the impact that the collectivity of the funding is having, and to use that reporting and the data and the evidence that we collect to inform future investment decisions and to inform the advice that we give to you. We know that there are areas of underinvestment where we have identified a social need in the city. Homelessness is a good example, and we know that there are areas of underinvestment in that space, but because we haven't had the ability to prioritise that as much as we could within the fund, we haven't been able to address some of those needs. And what we want to do is better enable the grant subcommittee and all of you to be able to make more effective decisions based on the directions you give to us around the strategic priorities of the fund. Sue is going to talk to now the work that she's been doing with the sector and with some of the organisations that we do and don't fund. Sue.
Thank you. To summarise, it won't be a surprise to anyone around the table that it's a really tough environment out there for charities, and it's also tough for funders. There's a lot of demand on funders to evolve and kind of meet the high community need that they're seeing. And the expectation is that this environment's going to continue for some time. There's a lot of change occurring out there, as well as the tough financial aspects of it. And I guess we can expect that Wellington City Council will see higher demand, not less demand, in coming years for its funding as long as this continues.
Thanks, Sue. So in terms of what we're proposing to do, we have a paper in the Forward programme to come to you on the 19th of March with some further detail. But basically what we'd like to do is reconfirm the purpose of the fund around the social wellbeing framework. And as David says, this will enable us to sort of better focus the priorities around the strategies that we've got. Largely speaking, the mix we've got, if you remember that first slide, something like 70% of our funding goes to 50 organisations on multi-year funding. So there's, a reasonably long list of organisations there. And obviously, there are priorities that we've got through the different strategies that have come on board in recent years, certainly. And we want to tie those into the way the fund behaves. And as David says, fix the timing so that we can talk to councillors, around what those priorities would be. So really the decision that we'll be asking you to make is around how we align those priorities, really. Largely the mix between longer term funding for organisations so they know what's going to happen with their funding and a smaller amount through one-off grants is probably still the same sort of mix of funding. But obviously some of the percentages of the way the fund's allocated, we want to talk to you about how that might change. So I've got 3 examples that we'll just kind of work through. So the first one here is around our funding for children and young people. So something like 10% of our multi-year funding, which was about 370k last year in the 2023 year, goes to 6 youth organisations. And then there's a smaller amount of our multi-year funding that goes out through kind of one-off grants. And you can see the strategic priorities listed there. And we feel like this balance is probably okay in terms of like maybe it's a 10 or a 15% of that multi-year funding going to these sort of youth organisations. But we do know that within the priorities, some things these organisations aren't doing. So, obviously the grants, the one-off grants will be used to fund those kind of things. So the next one we've got is an example around homelessness. So in the homelessness space, we support 4 organisations with almost a quarter of our multi-year funding. So, so that in 2023, that was about 900,000. And then we also do some one-off smaller grants through the one-off grants that come through. And in terms of the future approach, we'd see this as, as probably a balance that we need to have a look at, because there are some gaps in our funding around homelessness that have been identified in the sort of homelessness plan that we've got. So we'd probably see the mix here to be more focused on longer term support for organisations who are trying to make systemic change and have longer term strategies. So that's where we'd see the balance probably shift a little bit. And then the final one here is around CHI, around provision around food. You can see the strategic priorities there. So at the moment, we only spend 1% of our multi-year funding to support one organisation. So this is Kibosh. And then through the grant rounds, and those councillors who are on the grant subcommittee will have seen this, we have a lot of demand from organisations coming in every year for one-off funding. So in terms of our future approach, we probably see this needing to change a little bit in terms of being able to enable some of these organisations that can serve on the strategic priorities to be able to have longer term funding. So that might be an example where the mix might change a little bit. In terms of what sort of things we're going to have in the paper, there's a table here, and we'll just talk through some of these briefly. We haven't got much time today. Some of these are largely process and administration things. As Sue said, we talked to quite a lot of funders and organisations, so some of these things we can fix through our processes. So the first one is around having a weighted assessment framework, so the priorities that are set through the long-term plan can be aligned with the way we assess applications, and then obviously the decisions will end up being reflective of those priorities. As I said before, the mix between having longer-term support, multi-year support and one-off grants probably needs to stay. I think we had quite a lot of engagement with resident associations in our meetings that we had last week and the week before, and we wouldn't see anything changing in terms of the criteria would still be there for those organisations. So likely to be funded through one-off grants. We may look at the term of those grants, so to give people more certainty around timing. We have had quite a bit of feedback around the level of grant funding. So one of the things that we want to propose to you is that smaller grants be delegated to officers. Something like 12% of our funding goes to grants of less than $5,000 for all those applicants, and some of them can be as small as $500. They have to go through a process where the grants come to the grants subcommittee, and it has to fit the timing of that grants subcommittee. So what we're proposing is that the smaller grants get delegated to officers using the same criteria, the same priorities, and that will reduce the transactional costs and the administration around those grants. The next one is we've had quite strong feedback that if we better communicate our priorities to the applicants, then people won't waste so much time applying for funding where they clearly don't fit. And I know for some of you sit on the grants subcommittee, you see an enormous list of grants and it's hard to compare like with like. So improving our communication and being clearer about what we'd fund will help to improve that. David mentioned performance reporting, being proportionate around that. So someone who gets a smaller grant has to do less than someone who gets more money. And then obviously, like we've talked to funders, and there are probably opportunities for co-funding. We talk to funders about support beyond funding. And a good example would be where we're providing places for people to work out of, some coordination, those kind of things. So, for example, we're talking to some of the safety patrols around the central city and looking at how we can provide a base for them to work from, support with equipment and those kind of things. So being much more creative about how we can support organisations. So that's the gist of some of the main recommendations that we'll be bringing through. I'll just hand over to Sean now.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mark. So I'll just quickly run through what this will mean for our organisations. So prior to Christmas 2024, we met Kanohi Te Kanohi face-to-face with all 50 of our organisations that are currently receiving this multi-year funding. We will be bringing to you, or the Pito Pumanawa in May, a paper to approve funding for an additional 12 months for these organisations. And this would be part of a transition to the new funding framework, knowing that we've had a long-standing relationship and a current criteria for so long. And of course, as part of that, any grants over the 150k threshold will still go to the Social, Cultural and Economic Committee in May 25 as well. Now, the purpose of this was to provide an opportunity for our organisations to transition to new reporting requirements and allow these organisations time to make any necessary adjustments in line with our new framework. Now, this will mean that some organisations may not ultimately align with our new framework after this transition period, but we will, however, work closely with these organisations in the coming 12 months to understand how this may impact them and provide additional support where we can with winding down or transitioning services as needed. Now, next slide, we've just got a brief timeline in transitioning to the next LTP cycle. So March 25, we've got our framework hopefully agreed and a new name for our fund. In May, we will bring to you the paper for the transitional grants for our multi-year organisations. And come July 2025, we will have our new funding framework in place. Now, looking forward, in May, we will be going out to approve or recommend 18-month funding arrangements in line to the new framework and LTP timelines. And the purpose of this is so that come 2027, once we've got the new LTP adopted, we can have the decisions made around level of service to support any adjustments to the new funding framework and what our fund priorities will be for that next year, or cycle, sorry. And then come 2027, new agreements returning back to the 3 years approved based on refreshed funding priorities. So that next group of multi-year contracts will align with the LTP and the triennium.
Thank you, team. We raced through that. I know there was a lot of information. We have 10 minutes or so to hear any thoughts or answer any questions that you might have.
Right, thank you. We have got quite a few people on the list, so I might just limit us to one question for now, and then we'll roll through again. I have Councillor Pannett first.
Thanks. Have you asked some pretty deep questions about whether this is actually working? So obviously social problems are complex, but has this been a good place to check in whether we've got the right frameworks and the organisations we're working in will deliver proper change?
That is the intention of the new framework, and the performance reporting that will come along with it will help us to have a better understanding of the impact that our funding is having. At the moment, we fund people to do a thing, and they report back on the thing that they have done, but we know that we need to delve into that much more so that we have a better understanding of the impact that collectivity of funding is having.
Cool. Councillor McNulty.
Try and combine this into one. So there's 12% of grants that are less than 5K, and I understand the rationale around what you're trying to do, but at the same time you are taking, I guess, decisions away from elected members, but we still wear the political risk. So I guess the first part is, what's that total, when you take the 12% of grants, what's that total add up to that would be delegated into officer discretion under your changes?
That is a good question. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but we'll make sure we include that information in the paper. It is...
would it be six figures, higher than that?
It would be, yes. Yeah.
Right. I have a follow-up to that, but I'll go around.
Thanks, Ben. Councillor Abdirahman.
Kia ora for doing this, David and the team. My question is, you engaged with different communities. I wonder how much of that engagement went to the ethnic community, the refugees, and some of them. If you look at it in the refugee space, Changemakers Refugee Forum, they've been doing a great job in that space. They were established in 2006, a year after this policy implemented. That means it's nothing that reflects on what they want in this policy, in the strategy. Again, now, if you haven't spoken to community organizations that are doing on the level to those communities marginalized, I'm not sure in going forward how much of the benefit would be in it for them.
We have certainly spoken with Changemakers, and we speak with them regularly. Ultimately, it will be up to you as elected members to determine the social priorities of the city and the priorities of the fund. We will provide some advice in the paper around what we understand the social priorities of the city to be, and how that could translate to the priorities of the fund. But in terms of, elected members ultimately will have will make the decision around the priorities of the fund and how those priorities are weighted against other priorities.
Councillor Calvert.
Thank you. So I'm just a bit concerned that we're coming up to an election in October and the strategies, priorities of this council may well change. So how does that get reflected?
That is the exact issue that we're trying to resolve through the framework. So the long-term plan process is the opportunity to set the strategic direction of the city rather than the election, although I know the election has an impact. And what we're proposing to do through this is to develop a framework so that every single time, every 3 years, we approach the LTP and have a conversation about the social priorities and the social needs of the city. So we haven't done that since 2005, so it has been some time, and what we want to do is establish a framework where that happens on a regular basis in line with the council's processes.
Okay.
Deputy Mayor Phone.
Actually, I'm okay, thank you. Sorry.
Councillor Brown.
Thanks. I've just got 2 questions. One of them actually relates to your point about, co-funding.
Councillor Brown, just one question, just letting you know, you just get one today.
Okay, if I only get one question. Will the review, in that case, I won't talk about the interesting co-funding thing, but will our review look at our level of overhead cost associated with the system? Because I don't want to criticise the fact that I've got 4 of you in the room, but and I really think the grants are great, but I mean, do we look at what it actually costs us to actually hand the grants out and monitor it? And have we thought about whether there's be a way we could do that more efficiently?
Yes, we have. So we have a centralised team. Mark, Sean and the team administer grants from all of the funds on behalf of the organisation. We use a centralised grants management system in an attempt to maintain consistent processes and keep the transaction costs as low as we can. It does cost money to distribute that $5 million, and I don't have the exact figure to hand, but administrative efficiencies are something we're looking at all the time.
Thank you. I had put myself on the list for a part A. Understanding that the Living Wage Fund is ending mid this year, is there ability throughout this review, or have you considered putting the living wage criteria to support those events through the Social and Rec Fund?
We haven't. No, there is work underway on the Arts and Culture Fund, which I believe is working through the implications of the living wage decision.
Cool. Partai, Deputy Mayor Phone.
Right, I've got it this time. Just in your graph at the end, when we talk about the community centres being 31%, and just acknowledging that they govern themselves in different ways, and so is there any plan to streamline that or change those systems of self-management or governance?
There is a separate piece of work underway now that is looking at what is required to get to what is required for sustainable and thriving community centres. So that is a separate piece of work that is underway now. Not part of the fund, no.
It was an action under Te Aue Mapara, Deputy Mayor, yeah.
If we go back to our original list, Councillor Pannett, did you have a second?
Vulnerable communities and homelessness and making that part of city safety. Do we need to use that language around vulnerable communities? I think it sort of does place a victim label on, and I do agree with Tamitha Paul's point around homelessness being part of the city safety strategy. I would like to divorce those two. Can some thought be given to that?
Yes, we will take that note.
Councillor McNulty.
Yeah, so taking out 12% of the grants from basically oversight does bring some political risks, I guess, for the paper to come back. Would you consider something about how that 12% pool might have some interaction with the chair and deputy of the committee, just so that it's not purely pulled out and then we find out for a bad news story, for instance, something's been approved?
We're definitely working on that at the moment. Ultimately, it's up to you as elected members what you choose to delegate to officers or not. But as part of the paper, we will make sure we incorporate some, I was going to say safeguards. Safeguards is not it's not the right word, but regular reporting back to the committee on what those approved grants have been and that sort of thing.
We can probably include that as an option, Councillor. Yeah.
Oh, ngā mihi nui, that takes us to the end of the session. Councillor Chung, I'm afraid we're out of time and we have another drop-in session right now, but we will close the workshop then. Thank you so much for your time today.